All right, so we've come to the end of our four-part series here on the Vietnam War, guys. Like I said, there's no way that we could cover this in such a limited amount of time in its entirety. There are tons of great resources out there for you, though. Ken Burns, the documentary guy, made a great Vietnam series for PBS. There is a copy in the film library, but like I said, we can't get to the film library. But I encourage you, if this is something you're interested in, look at those videos I've posted on the playlist. Dig in, do some research on your own. Like I said, the things they carried and other books are a great way to get kind of a feel for what was going on in the Vietnam War. But we're going to finish up here talking about the end of the Vietnam War. This image is going to come back as we get towards the end. 1968 shapes up to be the election where the Vietnam War is going to be the most important um, issue that's going on in the election. What are we going to do? Are we going to keep this war? Is it something where no, we're going to try to get our troops out of Vietnam? And really, there are competing factions in the country. There are people that think, no, we need to stick with this. We've got to beat back the communists. There are people that say, no, this is the wrong war in the wrong place. This isn't something we need to be involved in. And so 1968 is an election all about this. The candidates have to answer what they're going to do, what they're going to do with the war in Vietnam. So 1968, Lyndon Johnson decides he's not going to run for president again. The stress of the war has gotten to him. I heard a story that said he actually had a son-in-law get drafted, and he had a lot of trouble with the idea that his son-in-law was going to go to Vietnam. And so kind of made him think, well, if I don't want somebody I love going to Vietnam, how am I sending all these other kids over to Vietnam too? People like Bobby Kennedy will emerge as a Democratic candidate who is against the war. There will be people like Richard Nixon, who we'll see in a second, who wins the election, saying he's going to bring peace with honor to Vietnam. One of the outspoken critics of the war in Vietnam was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and partly because he looked and said there's a disproportionate number of men of color and men from lower socioeconomic classes, so poorer people, that were being sent to Vietnam. A lot of times because they couldn't afford things like college, that type of thing that would get them a deferment. Um, so what they do is they end up um, starting peace talks in Paris. If you've seen the um, second X-Men movie, remember I told you the first one was um, had to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The second one of the new set is kind of surrounds the Paris peace talks, and it was a good one too. But 1968, the convention for the Democrats, where they're going to pick their candidate, was in Chicago. There's a lot of rioting. I'll throw some video up for you on the playlist here. Just kind of crazy. A lot of arrest and things that are going to be happening because of just the unrest around the war in Vietnam. The guy that's going to win, though, is going to be Richard Nixon. So this is going to be up to him to kind of figure out, okay, what am I going to do now? And so he shows up, having made this promise of peace with honor, looks at all his military guys, and they basically said, yeah, we don't know how to get out of here. We didn't have a real good plan for getting out. We don't have really just a great idea of how this is going to work. And so they convince him that what they need to do is kind of go after the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There are two countries next to Vietnam, if you remember that map from back then, Laos and Cambodia. Said, hey, the Viet Cong are being supplied through there. We need to be able to cut off those places. As a matter of fact, as I'm recording this, I just saw on Twitter, this is the 50th anniversary, May 1st, of President Nixon agreeing to bomb Cambodia, and Cambodia being bombed. Now, you can imagine how popular that decision was. You're being elected, promising to bring peace in Vietnam, and then you're bombing two other countries. Um, he does come up with the idea of Vietnamization. And Vietnamization was the idea that he was going to replace American troops with trained troops from South Vietnam. So basically, we were going to teach those guys how to defend themselves, how to protect themselves from the North Vietnamese, be a good military, and then as we did that, we could bring our guys home. Um, One thing that happens during this period of time too is there's I think it's the Washington Post that gets a hold of what are called the Pentagon Papers. Somebody smuggles out some papers, and a newspaper publishes them, basically showing that a lot of what the American public is being told about the war in Vietnam, or at least was in the Johnson administration, was a lie. A lot of the numbers they were getting, casualty figures, things about our progress, and it really makes people very, very upset. Talked about when we were doing the draft, protesting the war. There's a huge march on the Pentagon, and you see that in the picture here on the left, and then the Kent State Massacre from that video that was after the draft notes. There's the famous picture, but both of those are kind of famous pictures of campus protest during this period of time. One group of people that we worried about a lot were people who had been captured in Vietnam. POWs are prisoners of war. Prisoners of war were not treated very well by the North Vietnamese. Kind of the most infamous place was this place they called the Hanoi Hilton, very tongue-in-cheek. It was a really rough prisoner of war camp. Probably the most famous POW of the time was a guy named John McCain. John McCain just passed away within the last 2 years. He was a longtime senator from the state of Arizona, ran for president a couple of times. He was a Vietnam veteran who was captured. He was a fighter pilot. His plane was shot down. He was very badly wounded and spent years in a POW camp. The interesting thing, his dad was actually an admiral in the Navy, and so the North Vietnamese offered to kind of make a special exception for him, and he said, "No, I'm not." There have been guys who have been here longer than I am. I'm not pushing up in line just because of who my father is. One of the things that we see when we get to the Vietnam War is that now, especially with DNA and the type of technology that we see today, that you don't have the number of unknown soldiers that you have had in previous wars. One of the most hallowed places in our country is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Arlington National Cemetery. I've been lucky enough to go there a couple of different times, and it's a 24 hours a day guarded tomb that has the remains of men who died in each of the different wars that weren't identified. But there's no one in there from Vietnam. They actually used DNA evidence and figured out who that person was, and that's happened a couple of times in our history. I'll throw up a video of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on the playlist as well. Basically, by 1972, the North Vietnamese, they've come to the peace table. Nixon's at the peace table. And he says, okay, we're getting the heck out of here. And so the troop draw out starts. And in that kind of period of time right after the election of 72, before the Watergate stuff really hits, Nixon makes a promise to the leader of South Vietnam. Says, look, if the North Vietnamese come back, we'll show back up. We'll come back and help you out. Problem is, by the time the North Vietnamese do come back, and they do in 1975, Nixon's not president anymore. It's a guy named Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford decides, no, we're not going back. I'm not going to put our troops back in that situation. And so what you end up seeing is the fall of the city of Saigon. I've got an amazing video on the playlist of the aftermath of this. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam. Today it is Ho Chi Minh City. They changed the name when the country was unified. But the image people are going to see, and kind of the image that ends this era of the 60s, are these helicopters taking off from the top of buildings. They're taking off from the top of the embassies, places like that. People coming. These aren't just Americans. These are South Vietnamese who cooperated with Americans, and they're worried about what's going to happen to them, if when the communists come and take over. So these images are the ones people are left with. As you see these, they're taking people out just in droves, putting them on aircraft carriers. The crazy thing is they actually run out of room on the deck. They start to push the helicopters off into the ocean to make room for more people on the decks of these ships as they're coming out. And so, really, the last images that people have of the Vietnam War are these images of Saigon falling, everything that we'd fought for, these 60,000 guys that have died in the service, not to mention all the folks that are wounded. And you're saying, well, this is worse than Korea, right? At least Korea is still, South Korea is still there. Vietnam, we didn't accomplish anything, right? The country unifies under communist rule. It's not until the Vietnam War Memorial goes up in Washington D.C. That you start to see some healing happen. I'll throw up the story on the playlist of this as well. It's an amazing story of the young lady, not much older than you guys, who is going to design the wall. But if you go to Washington D.C., the names of every guy that died in Vietnam are on this wall. And there's a computer database you can go to and tell you where your the name would be of somebody that if you know somebody, your family had somebody that died in Vietnam. My mom had a cousin who was from Scott County that died in Vietnam, and his name's on the wall. I remember seeing that the first time I got to go to D.C. as a kid. But just a really solemn place, but allows conversations to happen. Like I said, if you know somebody that served in Vietnam and they're comfortable talking about it with you, it might be worth a phone call or FaceTime to be able to do that. But you could also ask people that didn't serve in Vietnam, but just may remember that period of time and what was going on. Ask them their reactions. It's kind of the cool thing about getting to this part of history, is now we're in a situation where you can talk to people who were actually there. So that is it for our Vietnam War coverage. Like I said, I'll throw some more videos at the end of this playlist for you.